here at the Center for Theology and Natural Science, which brings together the discussions of theology and science, little those two things, with a lot of people who, let's say, are so much smarter than me that it's great to be in the room and have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. But I felt smarter being there. So without further ado, Braden.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. I often try to cram too many things in, so we'll see how I do, but give you a quick sense of what we're going to be talking about today. I want to start with some actual data on what the Pew Research Center says people think about the relationship between science and religion. Then we'll talk about what we call in the field the conflict thesis, which is probably the default thing that people think about when they think about science and religion. And then we're going to use typology to be embarked, so one of the pioneers of the field created. There are lots of people that come up with lots of ways to classify the relationship, but I'm biased, but I think Ian's is elegant, easy to explain, and I also hold the Ian G. Barber chair. So we're a little biased, but our founder, Bob Russell, taught with Ian for 3 years before he came out to found the center. So a little bit about me. I'm the director of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. I'm the director of Theological Union, where I hold the Ian G. Barber Assistant Professor Chair in Theology, Science, Ethics, and Technology. Bachelor degree, don't major in genetics and religion, and lots of people said you can do that. That's why I sort of the title today. Master's degree from the School of Theology at Boston University, and then a PhD at the GT. A couple things I want you to think about before I give you the actual data. A couple questions here. Do you personally think that there's an inherent conflict between science and religion? Do you believe that for you or your own tradition that conflict exists? What about other Christians? What about Muslims? What do you think about their views? What do you think about Hindus? Buddhists. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the data. But here's a slide from that study from Pew Research Center. Is there a conflict between science and religion? This is Muslims across the world. And overwhelmingly, the larger category here is no. For Hindus, for the most part, except for Singapore, it seems to be a little bit of an outlier, the rest are strongly also no conflict. And for Buddhists, here the no's are from 50 all the way up to the 76. So again, not seeing an inherent conflict within people's own traditions is what they're reporting. Here we go with the thing here is most unaffiliated perceive science and religion in conflict. So if you ask people, are science and religion in conflict, those who do not go to church, who do not attend church regularly, are more likely to say yes, they're in conflict, or mostly compatible or often in conflict. You can see the unaffiliated, 76% say they're in conflict, but amongst practicing people, that number is slightly lower. So again, we often, people who are not inside the church seem to think that there's a bigger divide than those who are in the church. So, most U.S. Christians say that science does not conflict with their own religious beliefs. So again, maybe it's not a problem for me, but I think it's going to be a problem for other people's views, which says maybe a little bit about our own humility. A quote from this is that in a U.S.-based Pew Research Center survey, majority of Christians, 55%, said that science and religion are often in conflict when thinking in general terms about religion. When thinking of their own religious beliefs, however, fewer Christians, only 35%, said their personal religious beliefs sometimes conflict with science. The majority of U.S. Christians, 62%, said the two do not conflict. The new Pew Research Center findings show that most Americans, 59%, say in general that science is often in conflict with religion, although a sizable minority of adults, 38%, consider science and religion to be mostly compatible. Those most inclined to see religion and science as generally in conflict are those who themselves have no particular religious affiliation or are not religiously reserved. So I'd say that the conflict makes a better sound rate. So at the same time, most adults, 68%, say that there is no conflict between their personal religious beliefs and science. And we often see this, that people, even when it comes to using ChatGPT for, let's say, moral advice, people are more willing to say, oh, I didn't need the advice on the prompt, but other people would have needed this more. So we tend to be a little more secure in our own thoughts and beliefs than those of others. But if you break it down, and I'll go through this rather quickly and get to some other things, but depending on the type of issue you're looking at, those numbers seem to change. So if you look at something specifically like evolution, it really depends on how you ask the question. So if you ask the question is, have humans always existed in a present form? Humans evolved and God had a role in it, or humans evolved and God had no role. So you get different answers if you present the questions that way than if you ask it in a two-question format. The first of which is, humans have always existed in a present form, or humans have evolved. And then if they say they've evolved, you ask the second question, God had a role or God had no role. Now it's interesting because at first glance those don't seem very different. But you get different numbers when you ask those questions. So here we go. So single question, so when you ask it once, you get a breakdown of fewer people saying that they've always existed in that present form, a larger group of people saying that they've all guided by God, and then 33% would say they're just natural processes. But when you break it down to two questions, you actually get more people to say we've always existed in the way that we are. So again, you wouldn't expect that to make a difference, but the way in which you ask the question really prompts people to think differently about their answer. So, why is the idea that science and religion are always in conflict such an enduring part of popular culture? Well, historically people look to things like Galileo and Darwin as examples of this conflict. But really neither of those cases break down as simply as they can. Berkeley Rep this past year had a musical about Galileo. I didn't get to see it, but definitely doesn't do a good job of portraying the actual complexity of the whole situation. So there are historians who've been doing work into where did this idea come up? How can we trace this back? And really, it started in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment rationalists who wanted to look at a materialist way of understanding the world, only what we see, only what we can observe is what's true. That was further on by Victorian views, and then there are some scientists and atheists today that continue to push that idea. So some famous names that have come up in promoting that conflict thesis, we've got Voltaire, Thomas Paine, Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's Bulldog, a strong advocate of Darwin's views in the UK, John Draper. So there are some people in the field now that identify this as the Draper thesis, because Draper wrote a book about this. And he was an American chemist. He was the first president of the American Chemical Society. And then another name in the United States here is Andrew Dickinson White, who was the first president of Cornell. So particularly in the United States, Draper and White were some of the most vocal people in promoting what we now call the conflict thesis. So there are other myths and misconceptions about science that help fuel this. Things like, oh, Columbus didn't know whether the world was flat. Well, the Greeks had been able to calculate the circumference of the globe. I mean, the world knew that the world wasn't flat for a long time. Again, misconceptions about Galileo and what happened there. The sort of speaking trial here in the United States and Tennessee about evolution and the teaching of that at school. So a quote from one of our colleagues, from Ian himself here, is that today the popular image of the warfare of science and religion is perpetuated by the media, for whom controversy is more dramatic than more subtle and discriminating positions between the two extremes of scientific materialism and biblical worldviews. Again, in a 24-hour news cycle, we have to break things down into 140 characters. It's a lot easier to get across the point of conflict rather than something else. So if you're interested in exploring more about the conflict thesis and the history of that, we recommend Warfare Between Science and Religion, The Idea That Wouldn't Die, and that's a book that's edited by Jeff Harden, Ronald Numbers, and Ronald Vinson. And then within our own journal, Theology and Science, we had a great piece by one of our colleagues, Joshua Moritz, War That Never Was, Exploding the Myth of the Historical Conflict Between Science, Christianity and Science. So, let's do a brief biographical information about Mr. Barber. He taught at Carleton College, had a BS in physics, a Bachelor of Divinity, which is now in Div, from Yale University. He gave different lectures from 1989 to 1991. He won the Templeton Prize in 1999 and donated that to the center, which is what prompted us to be able to found the Ian Barber Chair. Ian Barber's Issues in Science and Religion, published in 1965, has been credited with literally creating the contemporary field of science and religion. So some of his famous books are Issues in Science and Religion, 1966, Myth, Models, and Paradigms, where he breaks down the methodological similarities between science and religion. His two different lectures, one, Religion in the Age of Science, the second, Ethics in the Age of Technology. And then I think this is a great book if people are interested. This is sort of an update of previous works that's written for a popular audience. When science meets religion. So he's a fourfold typology: conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration are these four ways in which people relate to science and religion. And I think they get increasingly harder to understand, so let's start with the easy one. Conflict. So conflict, again, is saying that there is only one way of understanding the world. It's either what science tells us or it's what religion tells us. Truth exists in only one sphere of knowledge, and the two are actively competing. Well, it's interesting when you do that, because Barber ends up putting scientific materialists and biblical literalists in the same category, because they actually have the same assumption there, that their side is the only way of understanding the world. And those are two groups of people who do not want to be in the same category. But both claim that science and religion make rival literal statements about the same domain, the history of nature. So a person must choose between them. That's a quote from his book on Science and Religion. So views that you might find within this category again are scientific materialism. And if you're not familiar with that term, that is to say that all that exists is matter, that which we can see, taste, touch, feel, experiment on, observe. So there's nothing that we don't consider spiritual. So first of all, that's materialism, the claim about the nature of reality, only matter exists. It's a metaphysical position, that there is no way to actually prove whether or not this is true. Now, science needs to believe this in order to operate. So the scientific method requires methodological reductionism. The idea is that you can sort of bracket out everything other than the parameters you're looking at in your experiment to isolate the variables. You have to assume that the universe is operating the same way every day, or else you couldn't do a repeatable experiment. But it's a step to go from methodological reductionism to say when I'm doing an experiment, this is how I'm going to view the world, to say that this is how the world actually is at all times. And so that's a distinction that some scientists don't seem to be able to make. Richard Dawkins is a great scientist, but he's not a good philosopher. And so I don't think he recognizes that he's actually making a metaphysical assumption when he says that all there is in the world is the truth. So metaphysics is a division of philosophy that's concerned with the fundamental nature of reality and being, that includes ontology, that's being, cosmology, and often epistemology, how we know. So for scientific materialism, matter is all that there is. But it's also scientific, and that the scientific method is the only reliable sense of knowledge. That's your epistemology there. That only science gives us truth. It's also, again, a form of reductionism. Like I said, science can't operate without methodological reductionism. You can't attribute divine intervention to a scientific experiment because nobody will ever be able to replicate that study. Another idea with reductionism, you can break everything down into its smaller components. So human being is systems. So systems have organs, organs have cells, so on and so on. Until we get to subatomic particles, and I'll let the physicists, I don't even know things beyond basic atoms. So, but along those lines, biology is constrained by chemistry, which is constrained by physics. So, in other words, these areas of science have emerging properties. So, Bob Russell used to use a great example to say that wetness is not a category in physics. physics tells us which molecules can make up something like a glass of water. But in chemistry, it's actually how those molecules relate to one another to create something like surface tension where you actually get something that's wet. So chemistry has to be controlled by physics, but emerging properties can come from that. And life, we would say, is something that could emerge from chemistry. We still don't necessarily understand exactly how that happened on Earth. And there's actually a study that just came out that shows that life may be even older than we thought on Earth, maybe going back 4 billion years. I haven't had a chance to go through the whole study, and I just saw the headline this week. Some people argue that then theology is maybe the most constrained because it has to go through all the natural sciences and then all the social sciences. So when somebody like Aquinas would call theology the queen of sciences, that's great, but in some ways it's also the most constrained because it also has to deal with our understanding of all of these other fields. So again, ontological reductionism. This is the method. This is the assumption that the materialists claim that matter is all there is. So again, metaphysical assumption about numbers. Again, people like Dawkins don't understand the distinction between methodological reductionism and ontological reductionism. So they reject philosophy and argue that the distinction doesn't exist, or they're willing to conflate those two because it serves their purpose in their argument. So the other side of that, we have biblical literalism, that Scripture is the only reliable epistemology. That's the only source of knowledge. So a lot simpler to talk about than science per se. If it's not in the Bible, then it's not, it's not true. Although I don't imagine there are many people in this room that would hold that kind of view. So let's move on to something that might be a little more in people's wheelhouse here. The next one is independence. The idea here is that science and religion operate in separate domains of knowledge, or they're different languages and functions. One example of this might be Steve J. Gould's non-overlapping magisterium. You might have heard of that. Here are 2 pillars of knowledge. You have theology tells us about God and about the supernatural, and science tells us about nature, what we observe here in this world. So science and religion deal with separate aspects of the knowledge. Another position that takes this is the neo-orthodox position that God works through history and not nature. So religion can tell us about how God acts, science can tell us about how the natural world is. I would say that when I was in college, the head of our microbiology department held this position. One day we were in bacterial physiology class, and somebody asked why something provided flagellum of bacteria. I don't remember the exact question. But the professor walked up to the board, turned his back to us, wrote "why" with a question mark in capital letters, and he said, he points down, he says, "We do how," and then he points across the way, which is the building that had religion, philosophy, and psychology. He said, "They do why." And then he just went back to his lecture. So, so the distinction here again is between primary and secondary. The idea here is that so some Catholics would find this very compelling and say that God is primary cause in all things, and then God works through secondary causes, which can include nature and natural science studies. So theology in some ways is primary cause, science is secondary cause. Different language and functions, again, this is slightly different than saying different domains in that they have different functions or roles in society or our understanding of the world. So scientific language is about prediction, it's about explaining things, it's about control. Religious language is meant to evoke emotion or promote morals, to teach us something, to get us to act in a different way. Science isn't necessarily saying we should alter your life. Now, lots of people read scientific studies and say, oh, maybe I should cut this out of my diet, or maybe I should do X, Y, or Z, but that's not the scientific method itself. So independence doesn't have to be conflict. It can be complementary. It can be completely siloed off, and you don't have to listen, but there is at least room for some kind of conversation between the two. So again, science can maybe be how, religion could be why. But some people actually want to see how far can that conversation go. So we get to the next part of the typology, which is dialogue. And so with dialogue, we talk about presuppositions that people are making about religion or about science. There are questions about limits and boundaries. And as one of these books cited there, methodological and conceptual parallels. So we talk about myths, models, and paradigms, that are things that we use in both how we do theology and how we do science. There are some methodological similarities. Not completely, the labs are the same, but there's enough room where we can then have conversation. So religious views did have an impact on the formation and legitimacy of science. A lot of scientists centuries ago were religious folks. And the Vatican Observatory is still active in doing scientific research. So they clearly didn't see a conflict centuries ago. And Bob Russell gives his own method, which we won't have time to talk about today. He talks about how science, or how religion can be used to motivate scientific research or to choose between competing claims. And one of his favorite examples is Braden. So, who created the steady state view of the universe. So when Bob was doing his PhD in physics, students had to decide, are we going to do Big Bang cosmology or are we going to study the steady state model? Well, Fred Hoyle developed the steady state model of the universe because he hated the idea that Big Bang seemed to support Christian creation. Christians were saying, Big Bang, T equals 0, that there is a time where the universe didn't exist and now it exists. Oh, that's clear evidence that God, created the universe. And Hoyle was like, I don't like that. So using the same data that was available at the time, he created a model of the universe that had no beginning and it's eternal and it always existed. And at the time, all the data in the field, both theories fit the same. So people had to actively choose. And at that point, religion can be a motivating choice, whether it's against religion or for religion. Now, since then, the data has come out and shown that the steady state model does not hold the data we know about cosmology. But for a time, it did. So, methodological and conceptual parallels. There are more similarities between how we do science and religion than some would like to do. Data can be theory-laden. What we mean by that is we're struggling to remove our own bias and our own understanding of the world or what we think is going to happen from even like things like machine learning. You can see that there's lots of bias that comes with things like ChatGPT, even misinformation. That would be another conversation. But there are things that are built in science, like people learn about population rates, or the simplest solution, the simplest explanation is often the best. Well, again, it's a philosophical assumption that doesn't necessarily have to be true, but tends to be built into the way that people approach or compare between competing theories. To say, well, this one's more elegant because it's more simple, it's easier, so this must be true. Well, the world's a messy place, and science bears that out as well. Thank you. Both science and religion use analogies and models. There's been a lot of work done on metaphor as well in both science and religion, because the world of quantum physics is very different than our daily world. And so how do we even begin to describe what that looks like? I certainly don't understand it when the quantum physicists start talking. One of the dominant philosophical views in science and religion is what we call critical realism. And the idea is that we have a real sense of what the world is, but it's probably an incomplete sense. That any model we have of the universe is not necessarily 100% true. And that can be because we learn things from science, it can be because maybe we're not able to observe everything. There are actually parts of the universe that we'll never be able to see just because of the limit of how fast light travels. The idea is yes, we know something about the world, but we don't necessarily know everything about the world. And so we are using sort of models like that. Maybe really good models, but it's not one-on-one mapping of this is reality at all times. Then you have Thomas Kuhn's work on paradigms, where he says that you get from one scientific theory to another because you start with a paradigm, let's say something like God created the world in 7 days. And now we we start chipping away at that because we start to see fossil evidence that, well, things are older than 10,000 years, or we start to see similarities in organisms, or we see multiple ways in which things like an eye or a wing have evolved. And over time, it starts to erode belief that the current theory, the current paradigm, is the best way to describe things. And at some point, we have what calls a paradigm shift, where you go one to another, which does a better job of explaining all the cracks and problems that we might see in the previous paradigm. And that's sort of how science moves. It says we move from one paradigm, it sort of breaks apart, falls apart, competing ones come up, a better answer comes, and we repeat the cycle. Then we have the observer problem in science and frame of reference. So again, we're talking about quantum mechanics here, so I may not get everything 100% right, but the idea is that the observer can make a difference in experiments. So Heisenberg has this uncertainty principle. You can tell where an electron is, or you can tell how fast it's moving. But as soon as you measure one of those things, the other one is impossible to know because you've interrupted. If you found this location, it's now no longer moving, so you don't know what its speed is. And then there's things like the double slit experiment, where it actually you get different results depending on what you're focusing on. Again, I don't understand quantum physics per se, but it does seem that there can be a role where an observer, and it doesn't even have to necessarily be an active observer, can make a difference in the results. So in that case, there's active conversation between science and religion, or there can be. Barber says we can actually go further. We can sort of maybe even put them together into one system or close to a system. I don't think all of it sees it as quite yet to a single way of understanding some of it. So he's got a couple different ways of looking at this. The first is natural theology. The second is what he calls theology of nature. And then the third is what he calls systematic synthesis. So these are three different ways we can try and approach integration. So the first of these is natural theology. The idea here is that nature gives us direct or indirect evidence from God. But we're moving from scientific data to a religious understanding or this theorem or doctrine. And so an example of this might be the argument from design. So people might look at something like the eye and say, well, this is clearly something that has been a lot of parts that have to go together to work just right. And so therefore it looks like somebody created it. And if so, there must be intelligence behind the creation. So the idea is that there are structures in the world that are too complex to not exist without some kind of intelligence. And it couldn't happen by random chance. And in a pluralist society, this can be attractive because the starting point here is scientific discovery. And people can sort of agree on the science. It's in the textbook, or you can read the article and you can say, okay, this looks like it was done from a reputable source. And different traditions can then sort of look at the results of that science or the implications of that science in their own way. I would say that most theologians in the field currently probably use what we call the theology of nature approach rather than natural theology. I would say natural theology sort of had its heyday in the 1900s. The theology of nature here is you're starting with religious tradition or doctrine. So we're going to talk about putting religion and science in conversation around Big Bang. So we start with the doctrine of creation. And from that, we then bring in insights from the sciences. And that could lead to a reformulation or a revision of the religious perspective. And your starting point is the theological commitment and not the science. So theology of nature and natural theology are two opposite ways of looking at things. So natural theology starts with the science and then moves to creating a religious position, whereas theology of nature starts with the religious position, brings in insights from science, and that can lead to a revision of your religious position. So in my own dissertation, I look at Reinhold Niebuhr's understanding of original sin and original righteousness. So those are my starting points. And then I try to bring in insights from the biological sciences to say, well, where might we be able to find some of these hints in biology? is really informing us that things are really more dynamic and changing. And that's one area in which I think that Christian theology sort of needs to continue to think through the implications of that. I think that we still have a sense of a hierarchy of being and a great chain of being, that Catholics might say, and that humans are at the top of that. And, it's not quite as simple as that, but sort of having a static understanding of nature or the species nature, being better understanding of nature, our relation to nature, to God, and even our understanding of human nature itself. I think that biological evolution has really slowed down on the human species, but it isn't completely done. And we still have cultural evolution. We look at the first humans who were able to master fire, and we still consider ourselves the same species as that, but now we've been to the moon. We've been to the moon in machines that have less computing power than what we carry on in our pockets now, and yet we still consider ourselves the same species. And I would argue that, at least culturally, there's been a huge shift. How static is being human? But a lot of that happens well beyond the span of our lives, and so it's hard for us to conceptualize that. And then I think the one that goes the farthest in terms of creating one coherent system would be Ian's understanding of systematic synthesis. And so here, science and religion both contribute to an understanding of the world under a united metaphysics. And so he gives two examples, one of which he followed. He was a process thinker. Is the process philosophy of Alfred Whitehead, metaphysics that had tons of categories and everything. There had to be a category for everything, and everything had to map to a category. I can imagine trying to do that. But that's one way in which you can do it. And in a process where God provides both novelty and order. In a lot of ways, God is luring us to the future that God desires in process. And then the other version of systematic synthesis, I don't know why the slide there is Neotomism. So for the Catholics who would use Thomas Aquinas and metaphysics, there's focus on science and religion where the Neotomistic understanding. Yes, Neotomism.
Okay.
So a new interpretation of Aquinas' understanding of metaphysics is sort of the grounding then of the entirety of the relationship between science and religion. So I think I was able to hopefully not really but I do like to give at least a few minutes if possible for questions. So thank you for your time.
Here, here.
Question, what, in your mind, is at stake for the church in trying to move towards integration or reconciliation?
Well, I think my basic answer would be, I don't necessarily feel like I need to advocate for any particular way of understanding. I would argue that conflict is bad and doesn't have to be. So I would say aside from that, I think there are valid reasons in which a person of faith could choose to have sort of an independence model, a dialogue model, or an integration model. As a theological ethicist, I would say that I find my most fruitful work from an integrated position, where I'm able to have insights from the sciences. A lot of my work is sort of, right now I was looking at things like gene editing and artificial intelligence, and sort of how the technological choices we're making are shaping who we are. And I find that evolution gives me a sense that human nature is a little more malleable and vulnerable than we thought. And so that gives me a better understanding of the world, which I think gives me a better glimpse into who God is as well. But I don't think that the church itself necessarily needs to say, this is the only way of relating science with it. I would say probably maybe a decade ago, it was maybe more pressing than ever, because there were a number of people in the church who were leaving the church saying that it was the church's opposition to certain views on science, things like evolution. I'm not sure that the data actually bears that out anymore. I think COVID has probably completely changed those things, so I would like to see new surveys about why people, particularly young people leaving the church, but I would have said even 8 years ago that, yeah, the church needs to show that it's not in conflict with science in order to maintain younger membership.
So would that be relevance?
I think in part, if people don't think you have something meaningful to offer, then they're going to go somewhere else, and they feel like the church doesn't have a sense of reality in the way that every person does. Again, I think that's why we're seeing that people who aren't a part of church feel that there's a greater conflict between science and religion than people who are regularly a part of church. So maybe it's a PR problem. Maybe the church needs to.
You don't think that some denominations have started back on science?
Oh, absolutely.
They have.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, a lot of them. I don't know a lot. A lot of people.
No, I would say,
I think it's a misconception.
Say more.
Well, I come from a very conservative church, the Church of
Yeah.
Christ. And certainly my grandmother thought that God created the earth in 7 days. My mother doesn't believe that, and she's an avid church member. And
Right.
my sister doesn't believe that, and she's an avid parishioner of the Church of Christ. So I think there's a misconception that's harbored by, I was really happy for you, as you pointed out, this new thinking that there was an active war on religious thought and leadership as a part of a materialist world that grew out of a rational age. And that is just so successful today that we have a hard time distinguishing our conceptions about what religious people think from the reality of when you talk to a person of faith, that they're able to reconcile those two things quite well. But it doesn't fit our narrative because I think honestly society is hostile to faith because faith represents a authority against, it's a conflict against authority. That's why they killed Christ. So I think it's the same concept.
I think it also depends on what you're defining as science. I think, 20, 30 years ago, evolution might have been a huge question. But I think today, human nature in the sense of sexuality, gender expression, identity is an area where there, I think, is active conflict in the church about the relevance of science in our understanding of how we relate to one another. That is potentially going to be people to say this is not my understanding of how God works or how the world works, and so therefore I'm going to vote not be here. Yep.
There was a time within like the last century where people could hold sort of biblical, literal suppositions and have anxieties about evolution and happily take their children to get their measles vaccine. That there's this underlying trust in science at a kind of cultural level, and not just COVID, but that COVID became a marker of the eroding of that trust that strikes me as one of the most significant shifts, sort of troubling ones that's gone on just in the last decades or so. So that science overall is not trusted at levels that strike me as not precedent.
No, I would agree. I think part of that is because some scientists, there people push a narrative where science has to equal atheism.
Science
Has to equal atheism.
Oh, right.
And there are religious people that make that assertion, and there are scientific people that make that assertion. And I think the majority of us would say, it doesn't have to be true, but it's drowned out from the voices on the ends that get the attention.
This was the mistrust of authority in general too, right? All authority has been kind of eroded, especially quickly.
Which then leads to politics desiring absolute authority.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't know, just hearing all of your classifications, where we could land in this conflict, it seems to me like dialogue is the best place to land. Is it that? Always? Because both sides are so malleable and they have to understand each other all the time. It seems like we always just want to find that position of dialogue.
Yeah, and it's tough when you take an integrated approach because you're hitching your wagon to science that can change. Our first director, our founder, Bob Russell, uses Copenhagen's interpretation of quantum mechanics to build his own theological view of eschatology for future pretty readily recognizes that if it turns out that Copenhagen's interpretation of quantum mechanics is wrong, the theological commitment that he's built up falls apart. And yet he hasn't seen another way to do it other than to take a stance and to do that. But I think it's probably easier to have dialogue than integration.
Yeah, well, no, you're actually just pivoted to what I was going to talk about, the impact and the leaps that have been made in quantum physics and the whole quantum study.
Mm-hmm.
Is how is that, I mean, because that's kind of that area of dialogue that seems to bring these together. You said nobody really understands.
Well,
I think
there are
that's a
people
bigger,
that do,
but I want you to, in whatever time, we could expand a little bit on that. That's what's happening there, because I kind of feel like.
Yeah, again, I'm not an expert in quantum physics, so I would say if you go to YouTube and you search CTNS GTU, you'll find our YouTube channel where we have videos from all kinds of conferences. And this last year on campus, we had a discussion between three scholars, Bob Russell, one of his doctoral students from South Korea who has a PhD in theology, and Phil Quick, who's a theologian down in Southern California. It was specifically about quantum entanglement and theology. And it's well above my pay grade, but I would say it's well worth watching that, trying to get a sense of it. But yeah, I think that I just don't have the expertise to be able to speak to
What is your sense? I'm not.
Yeah.
Just kind of being on the periphery.
Yeah, I think that